The air in the Vercetti auction hall was heavy, a stifling mix of vintage bourbon, expensive jasmine, and the sharp, calculating hunger of the elite. Adrian Vercetti stood at the center of it all like a slab of obsidian, dark, hard, and utterly unyielding. In his perfectly tailored tuxedo, he looked less like a guest and more like a judge. Before him, a line of the world's most powerful heiresses paraded by, their diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. They were masterpieces of silk and plastic, performing a dance for his favor that they had practiced since birth. But to Adrian, they were just hollow statues. He viewed the entire auction as a tedious play where everyone knew their lines, and he was simply waiting for the curtain to fall so he could return to the cold reality of his empire. He was already signaling his bodyguard to bring the car around, his mind shifting toward a blood-soaked shipment arriving at the docks, when the world suddenly fractured. She was tucked away in a corner, barely visible behind a mountain of imported peonies. She wasn't wearing a gown or pearls. She was in a simple white blouse and a beige florist's apron stained with water and earth. As she struggled to steady a heavy centerpiece, she looked up, her wide, expressive eyes meeting his. She didn't look at him with greed or fear, just a startled, authentic nervousness that made her drop a single stem of baby's breath. For the first time in 32 years, Adrian Vercetti's calculating mind went completely blank. The physical blow of her innocence hit him harder than any rival's bullet ever could. He dropped his mask of legendary composure, staring at the girl with the wildflower bouquet until she vanished into the service hallway, leaving the most dangerous man in the room visibly unsettled in front of the city's highest society. The city was still draped in the gray haze of pre-dawn when the armored door of Adrian's Maybach hissed open. The street lamps were humming with a low, electric buzz, vibrating against the silence of a Brooklyn side street. It was 4:54 a.m., and for the first time in his life, the King of New York wasn't thinking about his kingdom. He was thinking about a stuttering girl with dirt on her hands who had just dismantled his entire world without saying a single word. The auction house was a cathedral of vanity, draped in gold leaf and arrogance. Adrian Vercetti stood at the edge of the mezzanine, his presence a heavy, dark gravity that made the air around him feel thin. Clad in a black tuxedo that fit him like armor, he watched the proceedings with the detached gaze of a man who had already bought and sold everything worth owning. Below him, the city's elite moved in a choreographed display of silk and diamonds, a line of the most sought-after heiresses in the world parading past his line of sight like expensive property. They were flawless, curated, and utterly transparent. He saw the calculation in their eyes, the way they adjusted their poses to catch the light, offering him alliances wrapped in perfume and high-society pedigrees. To Adrian, they were nothing more than hollow statues performing a play he had seen 1,000 times. He looked through them, his mind already drifting toward the cold, sharp business of his empire, until he felt the first stirrings of a bored, predatory restlessness. He gave a sharp, imperceptible nod to his lead enforcer. It was time to leave this gilded cage. He was turning toward the exit, his hand adjusting a platinum cufflink with surgical precision, when a sudden clumsiness fractured the room's rhythm. In the shadows of the peripheral gallery, far from the spotlight of the auction block, a young woman was struggling with an oversized arrangement of white lilies. She wasn't part of the parade. She wore a simple beige florist's apron, stained at the waist with damp earth and the green nectar of cut stems. As she hoisted the heavy glass vase onto a pedestal, her foot caught on the edge of a stray rug. The vase wobbled, water slopping over the side, and a soft, panicked gasp escaped her. Adrian stopped. The enforcer behind him nearly collided with his back, sensing the sudden, vibrating tension in the boss's posture. The girl, Lila, didn't look at the crowd to see who was watching. She didn't check her reflection in the gilded mirrors. Instead, she looked at the lilies she had managed to save, and a small, breathless laugh of relief broke across her face. It was a natural, unforced smile, an unguarded moment of pure, clumsy humanity that felt like a physical blow to Adrian's chest. For a man who lived in a world of masks, her authenticity was a violent intrusion. Her dark brown hair had escaped its low bun, framing a face that held no hunger for power, only a gentle, nervous light. Adrian's calculating mind, a machine that never stopped running, went completely blank. He didn't see the heiresses anymore. He didn't see the gold or the greed. He only saw the girl in the stained apron. The most dangerous man in New York stood paralyzed by a girl who looked like she belonged to the sunlight, his legendary composure shattering as he realized his world had just stopped on its axis. He didn't know her name, but as he watched her tuck a stray petal back into place with trembling fingers, he knew the auction was over. He had finally found the only thing in the room that wasn't for sale. The street lamps were still humming with a low, electric buzz when the armored door of Adrian's Maybach hissed open, releasing him into the pre-dawn chill of Brooklyn. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp asphalt and industrial exhaust, a jarring contrast to the sanitized luxury of the auction house. His driver, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to Adrian's security, shifted uneasily in the front seat, his hand hovering near his holster. He didn't dare speak, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. A Vercetti did not stand on a desolate corner at 4:54 a.m. unprotected. Adrian signaled for the car to pull around the block. He didn't want the tinted windows or the humming engine to act as a barrier this time. He stood by a rusted green bus stop pole, his tailored overcoat worth more than the nearby bodega, feeling a strange, vibrating vulnerability he usually abhorred. He was a man who moved through the world as a predator, yet as the first bus of the morning screeched to a halt, he felt like a ghost searching for a haunt. When the doors folded open, Lila stepped off, her movements heavy with the exhaustion of a double shift. She was still wearing the same beige apron, now wrinkled, and her hair was a messy halo of dark curls. She stopped short when she saw him, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering yellow light of the street lamp. She didn't scream, and she didn't run. She simply stood there, her small bouquet of leftover wildflowers clutched against her chest like a shield. "Why you?" she whispered, the stutter catching in her throat as she looked at the man who had stared at her like a hunter only hours before. What are you doing here? This isn't your world." Adrian stepped forward, the movement slow and deliberate to keep from startling her. The legendary composure that had made him the most feared name in the syndicate was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged edge. "I haven't slept," he admitted, his voice a low gravel that seemed to vibrate in the quiet street. The confession felt like a betrayal of his bloodline, but he couldn't stop the words. "I spent my whole life being treated like a piece of property, a legacy, a weapon, a name on a ledger. People look at me and see a kingdom or a target. But when you looked up at those lilies, you looked at me like I was just a man." He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the delicate fabric of her sleeve. "For the first time in 30 years, I didn't want to be a boss. I just wanted to be the person you saw." Lila looked up at him, her breath hitching. In the gray light of 5:00 a.m., the Mafia King looked less like a dragon and more like a man who was finally, desperately trying to wake up. The diner was a sanctuary of flickering neon and the comforting, rhythmic hiss of a flat-top grill. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a humble haze that felt more honest than the suffocating floral arrangements of the Vercetti estate. They sat in a corner booth where the vinyl was cracked and the laminate table was scarred by decades of late-night secrets. To the waitress behind the counter, Adrian wasn't a shadow of the dragon or a headline in the morning paper. He was just a man in a very expensive coat who looked like he hadn't slept. Lila watched him across the table, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug. The stutter that usually tripped over her tongue seemed to soften in the dim, golden light of the diner. She watched as he looked at the menu, not with his usual surgical focus, but with a genuine, quiet curiosity. For Adrian, the lack of expectation was intoxicating. No one here was waiting for him to issue a death warrant or sign a multi-million-dollar merger. There were no masks to maintain, no blood-soaked legacies to uphold. When the pancakes arrived, steaming and unpretentious, Adrian took a bite and felt a strange, jarring ripple of peace. It was a simple, greasy sanctuary where the stakes were as low as the price of a side of bacon. He looked at Lila, nodding the way a stray lock of hair fell over her brow and the dirt still smudging the edge of her apron. She was the only sharp image in a life that had become a blurred performance of violence and duty. "I don't think I've ever just sat Adrian murmured, his voice losing its predatory edge. "Without looking for the exits, without counting the seconds until I have to become the Vercetti name again." Lila reached across the table, her fingers briefly brushing his hand. Her touch was light, but it carried the weight of a revelation. "Everyone deserves to be just themselves sometimes, Adrian, even the people the world thinks are made of stone." In that moment, as the sun began to bleed over the Brooklyn skyline, Adrian felt his legendary composure dissolve. He looked at her and realized that for the first time in 28 years, he had forgotten his own name. He wasn't the boss, the heir, or the weapon. He was just a man eating breakfast with a woman who saw through the obsidian to the person underneath. He wanted to stay in this grease-stained pocket of the world forever, where he wasn't a king, but simply a person who was finally learning how to breathe. The peace of the diner shattered before they had even finished their coffee. It started as a low rumble of heavy tires against the curb, followed by the rhythmic slamming of car doors that sounded like distant gunfire. Adrian's head snapped toward the window, his eyes narrowing as the soft, human light he had found in Lila's presence was instantly replaced by a cold, predatory sharpness. 3 men in dark leather jackets crossed the street, their movements intentional and heavy with the weight of concealed steel. They weren't just street thugs. They were a cleanup crew from a rival family, sent to exploit the king's sudden lack of armor. "Stay behind the counter," Adrian commanded, his voice no longer a low gravel but a jagged, lethal edge. He didn't wait for her to answer. He stood with a devastatingly violent grace, moving toward the door before the bells could even chime. The collision was silent and surgical. As the first man reached for his waistband, Adrian didn't just strike, he dismantled. With a movement too fast for the human eye to track, he caught the man's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the quiet diner like a dry branch breaking. Adrian transitioned into a spinning strike that sent the second man through a plate glass window, the shards falling like diamonds around the man's unconscious form. Lila watched from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. This wasn't the man who had looked at her with vulnerability at the bus stop. This was the shadow of the dragon, a creature of absolute, unblinking violence. Adrian didn't breathe hard, he didn't show anger. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a machine designed for one purpose, to end threats. When the third man lunged with a blade, Adrian caught the knife midair, his face a mask of obsidian as he drove the hilt into the man's temple. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the fight. Adrian stood among the wreckage of the entryway, his knuckles bruised and a small, crimson spray across his crisp white shirt. He turned back toward the booth, his eyes searching for Lila, but the peaceful illusion had been irrevocably torn. Lila was trembling, her wide eyes fixed on his blood-stained hands. The man who had forgotten his name over pancakes was gone, replaced by the monster the world feared. She looked at him and didn't see a protector. She saw the physical reality of the blood-soaked legacy he carried. Adrian took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw her flinch. The collision of their worlds had finally drawn blood, and in the cold morning light, he realized that his presence in her life was a homing beacon for the very darkness she had almost helped him forget. The following afternoon, the sunlight through the windows of Lila's small flower shop felt cold, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the world by the black sedan idling at the curb. Lila was mid-arrangement, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus on a cluster of baby's breath, when the bell above the door chimed with a heavy, final thud. It wasn't Adrian. It was a man who looked like a more weathered, more hollow version of him, the chairman. Adrian's father moved into the small, fragrant space, like a shadow entering a sanctuary. His presence, turning the scent of lilies into the smell of a funeral. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at Lila with eyes that held the calculating hunger of a dynasty built on bone and ash. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he placed a gloved hand on the counter, his voice a dry, papery whisper that carried the weight of a death warrant. "You are a beautiful girl, Miss Moreno," he began, his gaze drifting to the dirt smudges on her apron. "But in our world, beauty is a variable we cannot afford. My son has spent 30 years as a masterpiece of discipline. He was a weapon, sharp and predictable. And then he met you." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her small, trembling frame. You are a glitch in a system that has run perfectly for a century. You are a tactical error he doesn't even realize he's making." Lila tried to speak, her breath hitching, the stutter locking her jaw tight. I don't. He's a P person." "No," the chairman interrupted, his expression as hard as the obsidian Adrian was born from. "He is a legacy, and you are a liability. He thinks his power can protect you, but he doesn't understand that his love is a homing beacon for every monster we've ever created. By standing next to him, you aren't becoming a queen, you are becoming a target." He reached out, his fingers catching a delicate rose petal and crushing it into a damp, red pulp between his thumb and forefinger. "Every moment you stay in his life, you are signing your own death sentence. If you truly see him as a person, then you will understand that to save him, you must be deleted from the equation." The chairman turned to leave, his coat snapping like a whip. "The Vercetti name doesn't allow for glitches, Miss Moreno. We simply unmake them." Lila stood paralyzed in the sudden silence of the shop, the crushed petal falling from the counter like a drop of blood. The peaceful illusion of the diner felt a lifetime away. She looked at her hands, still stained with the earth of her trade, and realized for the first time that the man who had forgotten his name for her was carrying a crown made of thorns, and they were about to tear her apart. The silence in the hallway of Lila's apartment building was the first warning, a heavy, suffocating stillness that tasted of copper and ozone. Adrian didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart thundering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When he reached her floor, the sight of the splintered doorframe made his vision go white with a cold, crystalline fury. The door was hanging by a single hinge, a jagged invitation into a world that had been systematically unmade. He stepped inside, his polished shoes crunching over the wreckage of a life he had tried to cherish. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a message. The small apartment, once filled with the scent of dried eucalyptus and the warmth of sun-drenched books, had been turned into a graveyard of memories. The sofa was slashed, the stuffing spilling out like entrails, and the shelves had been swept clean, her books discarded and torn. Adrian moved through the debris with a predatory slowness, his eyes searching for a sign of her, but the shadow of the dragon had been too slow. His power, his wealth, the very things that made him the most feared man in the city, had failed to act as a shield. Instead, they had acted as a homing beacon. In the center of the small kitchen, he stopped. On the floor lay the ceramic mug she had held at the diner. The one with the chipped rim she had joked was her favorite. It was in pieces now, 100 white shards scattered across the linoleum like fallen stars. Nearby, her simple florist's apron was pinned to the wall with a kitchen knife, the blade driven deep into the drywall, right through the heart of the fabric. It was a systematic unmaking of her sanctuary, a brutal reminder from his father that Lila Moreno was a glitch that had been deleted. A single, blade-cut thread from her sweater caught on the splintered wood of the table, swaying in the draft from the broken window. Adrian reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the fabric. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. As long as he wore the Vercetti crown, anyone he loved would be a target. He had tried to bring her into his light, but he had only succeeded in dragging her into his darkness. He stood in the ruins of her home, the calculating mind finally settling into a lethal, singular clarity. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted to tear the system out by its roots. If his legacy was a cage that crushed everything it touched, then he would burn the cage to the ground. He turned toward the door, his silhouette a sharp, dark blade against the wreckage, leaving behind the man who had wanted to be a person and becoming the ghost that would destroy an empire. The Vercetti headquarters was a monolith of glass and cold steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline, a fortress built on 3 generations of blood and silence. When Adrian stepped through the lobby, he didn't move like a son returning to his father's house. He moved like a ghost made of ice, a silent reaper passing through the halls of his own heritage. The security detail, men who had known him since he was a boy, instinctively flattened themselves against the walls as he passed. There was a lethal, crystalline clarity in his gaze that told them the man they once feared had been replaced by something far more final. He didn't go to his office. He went to the vault, the dark, subterranean heart of the empire where the black books were kept. These ledgers contain the names of every judge, every senator, and every rival family the Vercettis had bought or broken. To his father, this room was a treasury of power. To Adrian, it was the fuel for the coming fire. He began the surgical precision of his betrayal, systematically transferring encrypted files, diverting offshore accounts, and leaking coordinates of high-value shipments to federal channels. He was burning the world order to the ground, not with a torch, but with the cold, relentless click of a keyboard. The chairman found him there, standing amidst the digital ruins of their legacy. The old man's face was a mask of disbelief as he watched the monitors go dark one by one. "You are destroying everything I built for you, Adrian," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rare, serrated edge of panic. "For a girl, you would trade a kingdom for a common glitch." Adrian didn't look up. His hands moved with a predatory grace, finishing the final sequence that would strip the Vercetti name of its immunity forever. "You told her she was a death sentence, father," Adrian said, his voice as quiet and cold as a winter grave. "But you forgot that I am the one who carries the scythe. You didn't unmake her. You unmade me." By the time the sun began to rise, the Vercetti syndicate was a hollow shell. An empire of ash, waiting for the wind to blow it away. Adrian stood up, leaving the chairman screaming into the silence of a dead fortress. He walked out of the building without his bodyguards, without his armored car, and without his mask. He had spent his life being a statue in a gold-leafed ballroom, but as the sirens began to wail in the distance, he was finally just a man walking toward a horizon that was no longer stained with blood. He had burned the cage, and for the first time, the dragon was gone. The Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan was a fortress of gray concrete and cold bureaucracy, a place where the Vercetti name usually bought silence or looked the other way. But when Adrian walked through the glass doors, he wasn't there to demand a favor or grease a palm. He moved with a quiet, devastating intent, his presence stripped of its usual predatory arrogance. He carried a single leather-bound briefcase, the weight of it heavier than any weapon he had ever wielded. It was the physical manifestation of his social suicide, the black books that contained a century of secrets, sins, and the structural integrity of the Vercetti bloodline. The federal agents in the lobby froze. They recognized him instantly, the ghost they had been chasing for decades, the man who was supposed to be untouchable. Adrian didn't wait for them to reach for their holsters. He walked straight to the center of the hall and placed the briefcase on the polished floor. "I am Adrian Vercetti," he said, his voice echoing with a hollow, resonant clarity, "and I am here to end a dynasty." In the interrogation room, under the harsh, flickering hum of fluorescent lights, he sat across from the men who had made it their life's work to destroy him. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't bargain for a reduced sentence. With surgical precision, he began to peel back the layers of his own life, handing over the encryption keys to every offshore account and the names of every corrupted official. He was systematically killing the Mafia Boss, carving the title away from his soul with every word he spoke. The lead investigator leaned forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "You realize there's no coming back from this, Vercetti. You're trading a kingdom for a prison cell or a shallow grave. Your own people will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." Adrian looked at him, and for the first time his intense gaze wasn't meant to intimidate. It was steady and remarkably peaceful. "The kingdom was a cage," Adrian replied quietly, "and the people you think will hunt me are already chasing a ghost. I've spent 30 years being a piece of property. Today, I'm just a witness." He was trading the gold leaf and the bulletproof silks for the right to be a man without a shadow. As the agents began to process the mountain of evidence, Adrian felt the legacy of iron finally start to dissolve. He had committed the ultimate sin in his world, but as the handcuffs clicked into place, he didn't feel the weight of the steel. He felt the lightness of a man who had finally found the exit to a play he never wanted to star in. The boss was dead. All that remained was the man who remembered the scent of lilies and the sound of a stuttered laugh. The air in Montauk was a sharp, cleansing blend of salt spray and wild cedar, a world away from the suffocating luxury of the city he had dismantled. Adrian walked along the rugged coastline, his movements no longer dictated by the rigid, predatory grace of a man under siege. He had traded his bulletproof silks and tailored tuxedos for a simple linen shirt and worn jeans, his skin bronzed by the sun instead of the pale, artificial glow of boardroom lights. He was a man without a title, a man whose last name was no longer a threat, but a ghost. He found the small bakery nestled against a backdrop of windswept dunes. It was a humble place, with flour-dusted windows and the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread drifting through the open door. He hesitated at the threshold, his heart thundering with a vulnerability that no weapon could protect. He wasn't the shadow of the dragon anymore. He was just Adrian, a man who had burned an empire to find his way home. When he stepped inside, the bell chimed with a soft, silver note. Lila was behind the counter, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her hands covered in flour as she worked a mound of dough. She looked up, and for a heartbeat, the world went silent. The wide, hesitant eyes that had haunted his dreams for months searched his face, looking for the mask, the obsidian, the monster. Adrian didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket and placed a single, jagged shard of white porcelain on the counter between them. It was a piece of the broken mug from her trashed apartment, the only relic he had saved from the wreckage of her sanctuary. As it caught the morning sun, the porcelain shimmered like a promise. "The cage is gone, Lila," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to calculate. "I traded the kingdom for the right to stand here." Lila looked from the shard to the man standing before her. She saw the lines of exhaustion and the new, raw honesty in his gaze. She didn't look for the exit, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders losing their defensive tension. A small, shy smile began to pull at the corners of her mouth, the same genuine, unforced smile that had stopped his world in a gold-leafed ballroom a lifetime ago. Adrian smiled back, a real, clumsy, unpracticed expression that felt like a revelation. In that quiet bakery, the collision of their two worlds finally ended. They weren't a glitch or a tactical error anymore. As the waves crashed against the shore nearby, they were simply two people starting a new story, where the only thing that mattered was the person standing on the other side of the counter.